Good evening and welcome. I'm Emily Parsons, Deputy Director and Curator of the American Revolution Institute of the Society of the Cincinnati, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this virtual authors talk. The American Revolution Institute promotes knowledge and appreciation of the achievement of American independence by supporting advanced study, presenting exhibitions and public programs, advocating preservation, and providing resources to classrooms. Since 1938, the Society of the Cincinnati has done this work from its headquarters, Anderson House, a National Historic Landmark finished in 1905 as the winter residence of Lars and Isabel Anderson in Washington, D.C. So I hope you all will come and visit us when you have the opportunity. Tonight's authors talk features Dr. Sandra Moats of the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, discussing George Washington, the Society of the Cincinnati, and the origins of American neutrality. A talk based on her recently published book, Navigating Neutrality, Early American Governance in the Turbulent Atlantic. The book explores the origins of George Washington's 1793 Neutrality Proclamation and the unexpected role it played in energizing the US government's constitutional responsibilities to support and promote America's commercial and sovereign interests. The proclamation was shaped by the experience of the American Revolution, the military experience of President Washington and his advisors, and by close ties between Washington and French members of the Society of the Cincinnati, most of whom were affected by the French Revolution and many of whom were victims of its most violent excesses. Reports from France of chaos and upheaval convinced President Washington of the necessity of remaining impartial when France and Britain went to war in 1792. Dr. Moats' remarks this evening, which she has focused to this subject, will particularly focus on the lesser known but highly influential role of the Society of the Cincinnati in inspiring Washington to proclaim American neutrality. Sandra Moats is a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, where she has taught since 2004. Her research focuses on early American politics and culture with an emphasis on presidential history. She received her doctorate in history from UCLA in 2001. Navigating Neutrality, published by the University of Virginia Press this fall, is her second book. Her first was Celebrating the Republic, Presidential Ceremony and Popular Sovereignty from Washington to Monroe, published in 2010. She has held fellowships at George Washington's Mount Vernon and at the Institute for Research in the Humanities at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's currently working on a third book entitled Following the Founders, which explores the political culture that a younger generation of presidential candidates, such as Jackson, Clay, and Polk, developed to propel themselves into the White House. A little housekeeping before I turn things over to Dr. Moats. After the lecture, we'll have a question and answer session. So please submit questions for Dr. Moats using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Any technical related questions or comments can be submitted using the chat function, and our staff will be monitoring both of those. Now, please join me in welcoming Sandra Moats.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you for this opportunity to appear. And I enjoyed just our interaction and getting this talk set up. This book, my book has its origins in the correspondence that Washington exchanged with the French officers who served in the American Revolution. I came across as I was working on the revisions for my first book, and I was just struck by their frequency, their substance, the fact that he maintained close ties not only after the American Revolution, but into his first term as president with these four men. And so that really piqued my interest. And I kept kind of trying to figure out, what do these letters mean? What's going on? Why are they important? I tried to publish my study as an article and realized I needed a much broader canvas. And what these letters in the chapter, which is chapter 3 of my book, that deals with the correspondence, to me, it became a larger story about American neutrality, about the formulation of this policy, but also the influence these French generals had on Washington's thinking. And so something that I think you might have stumbled over, and people like, oh yeah, he's just staying in touch with his friends, turned out to, I think, have a much more important and broader significance, not just for Washington's presidency, but I think for American history. Neutrality is really one of those milestone enduring issues of our country. And to find the origins of that policy in these letters that owe their existence to the Society of the Cincinnati, to me is a very exciting thing, and it's just a real pleasure to be able to share the findings with your group and to talk about what the influence they had on Washington. I think the first thing that it's important to keep in mind about Washington is that Washington didn't go to college. He is, unlike his counterparts, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, Hamilton, but where his education occurred was on the battlefield. He started out in the British militia during the French Indian War, and then of course was the commanding general in the American Revolution. So this is he's a military man. He's an officer. That's his training. This opportunity, though, exposed him to these ongoing European imperial rivalries, particularly between Britain and France. And as luck would have it, he was able to experience Britain and France both as enemies, France as our enemy in the French Indian War, and then France as our ally in the American Revolution, and of course the reverse. Britain, he's a British officer, or at least in the British militia during the French Indian War, but then he's fighting the British in the American Revolution. When he becomes president, in his second term as president, France and Britain will go to war. This will be their third war in about a 50-year period. So if you're Washington, you've seen this movie, you've seen this story before. And I think that kind of exposure and wisdom, I think is an expertise and an understanding that just is very, very different than the experiences of people like Adams or Jefferson, who were both diplomats and see the world through a different prism, or somebody like Alexander Hamilton, who was very pro-British. Washington, I think, has a very keen eye what these two countries are about. And he also has a very strong sense that we need to put America's interests first, that we can't get swallowed up into these smaller contests, or these ongoing contests between Britain and France. I think something else to talk about is the actual correspondence. So the four men I'm dealing with, and I deal with in chapter 3, are Lafayette, of course, Rochambeau, who was the French army general, a man who was both a general and an admiral, a man named Disdain, please excuse my French, and then a fourth gentleman, who I just completely blanked on his name. That's not good. I have to check my index. Laurier. It's important to keep in mind that D'Estaing and Rochambeau, they're senior military officers. They're older. They're about Washington's age, a little bit older. Whereas Lafayette and Laurier, these are young men. These are men in their 20s. They actually both get commissions in the Continental Army. So whereas Rochambeau and D'Estaing are in charge of units of the French Army and the French Navy, respectively, Lafayette and Laurier are actually in the Continental Army, or they're actually in the US or the American Army. The correspondence runs from anywhere from 40 letters to 167. The most frequent letters are with Lafayette. Lafayette was a much younger man than a couple of these guys. Also, he has a very, very close bond and relationship with Washington. Washington considered Lafayette his adopted son. These letters cover basically three periods. They cover during the actual revolution. That's probably the fewest letters. It's the brass tacks of the war. Correspondence between Washington and Rochambeau, or Washington and D'Estaing, people like that, where, this is official military correspondence. Then the correspondence is after the war, and it really gains steam 1784 onward. This also coincides when the Society of the Cincinnati is being formed and organized. And as you all know, there was, of course, the American chapter, which Washington was the president of, and there was the French chapter. And what happens is, because there are a lot of organizational issues as to who's eligible to be a member and who isn't, there's a lot of correspondence that goes across the Atlantic between Washington and Rochambeau and Lafayette, because the French society has you had to be a higher ranking officer than you had to be for the American organization. And so what starts out as really kind of an organization's business turns into much more than that, because these letters then turn into a reflection of the men's time together during the American Revolution. And so someone like Rochambeau writes these very beautiful letters. They're these warm, heartfelt letters to Washington about what a great man he was and what a wonderful, camaraderie and bond that they had serving on the battlefield, and their mutual dedication to liberty and to, constitutional law and things like that. So the letters are, again, they're about the organization of the society, but they're also reminiscences and reflections, and a chance for them to celebrate their friendship and their bond. And again, they're all, 5 men are military men, and so they have that common bond. This is important, and in and of itself, the correspondence would be interesting and fascinating, because it gets to the organization and the building of the Society of the Cincinnati. But then we get into the third chapter of these letters. And this third chapter is from 1789 onward. And of course, 1789 is when essentially our US government opens for business. Washington, of course, serving as our first president. At the same time, these 4 men will assume roles in France's revolution. This, of course, 1789 is the year of the Bastille and the tennis court oath and the commitment to writing what at that point would seem like it's going to be a constitutional monarchy. And so, people are very excited on both sides of the Atlantic that the French Revolution seems to be paralleling the American, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and things like that. People in the United States are very excited about France and that they're following in our footsteps, our revolutionary footsteps. So it's a really important moment there. I mean, I always like to say in history, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, if you wrote this in a novel, no one would believe it, but this is actually what's happening. And so all 4 Frenchmen play different roles. Larourie he's in one of the governing councils. I think D'Estaing becomes in the Versailles National Guard, which obviously is very important. Rochambeau becomes the Marshal of France. And then Lafayette, who has the most prominent role, and he's the head of the Parisian National Guard. So he's in charge of protecting and taking care of the king. So again, in their own ways, each of these men are going to play an important role in the French Revolution. What this means then is this correspondence that started in the organization of the society now will become a correspondence about republics and governance, and Washington telling his friends what's going on in America and the good news and the successful launching of Republican government. In his first term, Washington will take several presidential tours to help promote the Republic and to promote citizens' connections to this government. And after he takes each of these tours, he writes to his French friends, and says, I've got good news to report. People are responding to this government. They're responding to the Republic. They're very excited about it. I hope the news at your end is equally good. And I want to see, he even says this, I want to see what we've achieved for you guys to achieve in France. At first, the letters he gets from his French comrades are, cautiously optimistic. They're like, we're sitting down to meet. We're starting to draft the Constitution. Within a year or so, by 1790, things are not going anywhere. The Constitution writing is not being all that efficient. One of the correspondents, one of the French officers, writes and says, we seem more interested in bickering and fighting and disagreeing than we do in actually accomplishing anything. Washington again stays on this optimistic note of, well, keep trying, you'll get there, I'm confident, all of that. The one person who's probably the most optimistic in his letter writing is Lafayette. And again, Lafayette envisions himself as sort of the Washington of the French Revolution, whereas the other 3 officers are a little more cynical, a little more jaded, and just kind of like, this isn't really happening the way we hoped it would unfold. Good news eventually comes in the form that, in fact, the Constitution has been written, and Washington's greatly relieved to hear it. Unfortunately, the French Constitution means something very different than the writing of our American Constitution. Our American Constitution helps stabilize and normalize and codify the ideas of the revolution. It helps kind of tame a lot of the, how far is this going to go? The French Constitution becomes an invitation to transform the world. And of course, we know where that story is going. Eventually, they'll decide that monarchy has no place in Republican government. And by Republican, we mean, representative government, a constitutional republic. So that means eventually they're going to get rid of the king. Then they decide, well, monarchy doesn't belong in Europe. Let's declare war on monarchy. And by 1792, early 1793, this fledgling French Republic has declared war across Europe with the idea of eradicating monarchy. So pretty ambitious. And then, of course, this will trigger the Reign of Terror. There's the original political party, known as the Girondins, who are kind of a little more easygoing, a little more optimistic, sunny kind of folks. Are replaced by the much more polemical, political, violent Jacobins. And of course, we've all heard of Robespierre and all of that. And suddenly, everybody is seen as an enemy of the state. And we end up not only with violence across Europe, but violence within France, as everyone is perceived as an enemy, executions are widespread, things like that. So as I've said before, because Washington trusts these men, because there's a very, very strong bond between them, and because he served with them on the battlefield, he gets to see this. He gets a front row seat to this evolution from what started as a promising constitutional transformation and embrace of Republican ideas to a very violent and chaotic situation. I think it's pretty clear that Washington would never have allowed the United States to become involved in a European war. He would just found that to be foolishness, especially a war between Britain and France. But I think what's important is these letters really seal the deal. I think any sort of sentiment or nostalgia or feeling of obligation, these letters cure Washington of that. Because it would have been very easy for people to say, especially people who are pro-French, we owe them. They helped us in our American Revolution. It's time for us to reciprocate. And I think Washington has enough evidence and enough intelligence from what's specifically happening in France. He's not going to fall into that. And I think this is also something that separates him from somebody like, say, Jefferson, who might have been inclined to get the United States more allied with France, or Hamilton, who might have seen an opportunity to get the United States more allied with Britain. Again, Washington's path and his argument is American interests. We don't need to take sides with Britain and France. They have their own interests and their own problems. We need to worry about the United States and promoting Republican government. So again, I think these letters play a crucial role, one, in getting Washington to reject a renewal of the alliance that we had with France during the American Revolution. Also in terms of avoiding giving France any kind of tangible assistance in terms of money, in terms of weapons, in terms of soldiers, anything like that that could be misinterpreted. And I think lastly, it affirms Washington's thinking, his thinking that what goes on in Europe doesn't concern the United States. And I have firsthand proof that what's going on in France is just something we don't want to be mixed up in. And so again, he takes the kind of lessons of the geopolitical lessons he's gotten from the battlefield, from his own firsthand experiences. And then these letters, this correspondence, just cooperates and affirms, and I think fills in any sort of weaknesses or doubts that he might have. It's heartbreaking to read some of these letters when Lafayette is imprisoned in 1792, I think. Washington's just desperate. He's very upset, and he even writes Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State at the time, and he says, "Is there anything we can do to help out Lafayette, to get him out?" Washington writes to Lafayette's wife. I mean, these are very strong personal relationships Washington had with these men, and so I think it also is heartbreaking for him to see on a personal level what happens to them. And so for the United States and for the Neutrality Proclamation, the crucial moment will be in March of 1793. Warfare has already been going on between Britain and France for a couple of months. And we'll finally get a newspaper or a letter from France that arrives in a boat in Philadelphia that says, France and Britain have been at war for the last couple of months. And once that news arrives in the United States in late March 1793, Washington convenes his cabinet and says, we need to respond. We need to have an official response to this. We can't risk having Americans get involved. We also can't risk having Britain or France think we're going to take their side, or we're going to help them or aid them. And, and this is a really important moment. Washington wants to get ahead of the story because he fears that this would just swallow us whole. He even says that. He says this mighty contest that doesn't really involve us and will do great harm to us as a small young nation. And so it's very, very important to him that we get in front of the story. Something to keep in mind about what is neutrality. In the 20th century, particularly in the early 20th century around the world wars, neutrality is associated with isolationism. That's not what neutrality means in this context. What neutrality means is we're friends with everyone, we're free to trade with everyone, but you'll leave our ships alone, we're not going to get involved, we're staying out of it. So it's not we're going to close our eyes and put our head in the ground and pretend this isn't happening. What it's saying is, we know you guys are at war, but we're not at war with you, and we're going to stay out of it, but we still want to trade freely, and we shouldn't have our ships used one way or the other to promote this conflict. And so that's what neutrality means. It means free trade. And it's not a pacifism. It's not isolationism. It's also not a statement of weakness. It's a statement of this is the role we plan to play in the story. The other challenge that you have in this period, because trade is so important and because navies and shipping are so important in this war, France in particular tried to enlist American merchant ships to be privateers. So basically to act as warships. France, the violation of American neutrality because it's drawing American sailors and ship captains into a war that doesn't concern us. Secondly, Britain wants to attack American ships, one, because they suspect them of being privateers, and secondly, because they know these neutral American ships are carrying goods and foodstuffs that could potentially benefit the French. And so that's the specific area in which the United States ends up getting drawn into this war by its own citizens. And that's, to go back to Emily's introduction, that's where activating the US government becomes so important, because you can claim neutrality all you want, but unless you have a government capable of enforcing this policy and keeping your citizens out of a war, you're not going to get very far. And so the bulk of my book, my book is basically in halves. The first half deals with where did this idea of neutrality come from? It comes from international law, it comes from treaties, things like that. Obviously, the source of American neutrality through these letters that Washington exchanged with his friends in France. And then the second half of the book deals with the actual formulation and implementation of the policy over the next few years. So gets to the kind of the larger topic and the larger theme of early American governance and things like that. So to kind of wrap the story back, so as I mentioned before, his friends, his four French officer friends, do suffer a variety of fates. Lafayette, as I mentioned, ends up in prison for about 5 years. He's eventually released. He, of course, will come to the United States. This will be after, long after Washington's death. He will take a kind of a triumphal tour of the United States in 1824, 1825. He kind of helps renew people's memories and interest in the American Revolution. And he will die. I actually just looked this up today. He will live to the ripe old age of 76. So despite all the travails in the Revolution, French Revolution, he ends up enjoying a full life. Two of his colleagues are less lucky. Leroy, who had been involved in French politics, he dies in hiding, and his body is discovered, and his head is actually displayed in one of the assemblies as a message to enemies of the state, I suppose, during the Reign of Terror. D'Estaing, who had been the French admiral during the American Revolution, he's guillotined during the Reign of Terror. And then Rochambeau is imprisoned briefly and then is able to live out the rest of his life in peace, and doesn't suffer quite as badly as the other two men. So again, just to kind of wrap up my remarks, I was really surprised in discovering these letters and trying to kind of make sense of what was important about them. As I said before, yes, certainly constituting the Society of the Cincinnati was very important, especially the French chapter, renewing that bond between the United States and France, which was so crucial in the American Revolution. But I think, again, because these letters existed 3 different periods, that this third period that I study, the 1798, 89 and onward, really has just a very influential role in Washington's thinking about world affairs, Washington's thinking about understanding really the nuances and the difficulties in French politics and in French governance at this time, and just the chaos and the difficulty they have. I think also recognizing that France would not be a very worthy treaty partner, even if we were inclined to ally with them, that they're not a worthy commercial partner, even that we should kind of need to treat them at arm's length. And I don't think he would have had that kind of insight and intelligence without these letters. So I think they have an extremely important impact on Washington's thinking. And I think, again, give it depth. I think it reassures what he knows and his gut feeling and his instinct. And I think it takes an organization that ends up being quite impactful on American foreign policy well into the 19th century. And I think you wouldn't know this, but that these French generals and the organization of the society is the mechanism in which this comes together. I think it also gives Washington, and Washington's obviously a bright guy, but you have people like Jefferson and Hamilton, and they're going to be citing chapter and verse and treaties and philosophy. And Washington can approach this from a very pragmatic political stance, in large part because of the insight and the intelligence his colleagues, his fellow members of the society have given him as to what is exactly going on in French politics at the time and with the French Revolution, in a way that he can counter these more academic or intellectual interpretations that Hamilton and Jefferson might bring to the table. And they do, and he can say, no, I know what I know, and I have my own insights and things like that. So I guess I'll conclude with that, just to say that the society and this correspondence between Washington and the French members had, I think, a major and really unexpected impact on a major statement of American foreign policy, and a statement that endures through the 19th century. So, and on that note, I will end my remarks and take any questions. So Emily or Andrew, whoever wants to field questions. So.
Thank you, Sandra, very much for those very interesting remarks. Before we get to the Q&A, I wanted to give you an opportunity, since you were just talking about a pretty specific chapter of your bigger book on American neutrality and the Neutrality Proclamation, give you the opportunity to give us a brief summary of the book itself from sort of a broader perspective, rather than the more narrow subject that you just talked about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for me, it's a 7-chapter book. The first chapter starts in the colonial period, and it deals with the history of privateering, and the fact that privateering was very, very commonplace. Basically, from the time the American colonies were established, all of the European powers engaged in privateering to get advantages over each other. And so what this means is essentially turning merchant ships into ships of war who act on behalf of the government, whoever gives them the letter of marque. It could be the English or French or Spanish, and that other nations' ships and warships are fair game. Privateering is very common because you don't have a lot of navies at this point. This is even prior to the Royal Navy and when it becomes this powerhouse in the 19th century. So one of the things I try to chapter is how embedded privateering is, not just in the American experience, American consciousness, but in trading in general, that this is just part and parcel of life on the open water, whether it's the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. The second chapter deals with the concept of neutrality and free trade and its origins as a philosophical concept, the idea that trade doesn't always have to be about war and aggression. It actually can be a positive good, and it could be about exchange and moving forward. It doesn't always have to be about beating up the other ship. It also deals with efforts to establish the idea of free trade in treaties and things like that. And something I learned, which I didn't know before, was during the American Revolution, Catherine the Great organizes a League of Armed Neutrality among smaller nations in Europe so that they could stay neutral during our American Revolution, which is fascinating because they don't want to get mixed up with Britain, Spain, and France. And so it's interesting, while we're trying to get recognition for our independence, they are trying to do what we're going to be doing 30 years later. Chapter 3, as I mentioned, deals with Washington's firsthand experiences with what's going on in France, and I think reaffirming his commitment to putting the United States' priorities first. Chapter 4 deals with the formulation of the proclamation in a very deeply divided and partisan cabinet, and Washington's real skills at negotiating among the notoriously unfriendly Hamilton and Jefferson and getting them to work out a compromise at a time when you wouldn't think a compromise was possible. And he gets all 4 of his cabinet members and himself to agree on this policy. And that's really remarkable. Chapter 5 deals with the fact that we have not worked out any enforcement ideas at all. And American sailors and captains are being drawn in as privateers on a daily basis. The notorious Citizen Genet, the French minister, he shows up in America with 300 blank commissions to enlist American privateers. That's pretty brazen. Chapter 6 deals with the Congress and the courts getting involved in enforcement. And then lastly, chapter 7 deals with basically taking this policy overseas and to enforce neutrality across the world. Probably most of our audience, treaty, among other things, is an attempt to work out more favorable trading relationships. It also sets a commission that helps restore American ships and ship captains, because you lose your ship. It's like a truck driver losing his truck. You can't move anything. Also, if you lose your ship, you're going to get stranded wherever you are. It's not like you can hop a plane and come home. So the United States government not only tries to promote neutrality internationally through diplomatic agreements, it also comes to the aid of American sailors. And to me, this is an important moment because it says, listen, I know you guys like to privateer. I know you make a lot of money doing it, but there are benefits to being a United States citizen. We can help you out. We can bail you out. And so we send envoys all over to the Mediterranean, to the Barbary Coast, to the Caribbean, to England, to Spain, to get our sailors home and also work out more favorable trading relations. And so that's the final chapter. So, kind of taking the policy global. So.
Great, thank you for that. Now we can jump in. We have questions flying in, which is great. One, which I think flows from the summary you just gave us, was from Daniel. What are the 2 or 3 most important things we should know about the implementation of the neutrality policy by the Washington administration?
Oh, that's a really good question. Something I talk about is this idea of, I mean, we're not very far into our new government. We're 4 years in when the proclamation's issued. So the government really hasn't had to do a lot. It's very much a paper republic. And I think for me, what makes this significant is that it does require us to look at, well, we've got these 3 branches of the Constitution, and what do they do? We know that there are neutrality violations occurring in American ports. Who should report them? We know that you have offenders. Who should prosecute them? Who plays what role? Really basic stuff like that has to be worked out. So I think that's one thing, is transforming the government into an actual functioning enforcing government, not just a paper republic. I think the second thing is Washington, both as a political negotiator. I mean, I think Hamilton and Jefferson get a lot of credit for what happens in his presidency. And this is Washington. This is his policy. This is his baby. He's the chief architect. If he has to do, jumping jacks for an hour to convince somebody, he'll do whatever it takes to get this policy through. Then I think the third thing, and going back to Washington, he's not just a political negotiator, but he's also a statesman. And for him, it's also the big picture. And so not just enforcing it at home, but making this, a US policy and putting his own backing behind it. And so I think he very much emerges, like I said, as the chief architect. He's not just a symbol. He's not just the marble man sitting there while everyone else makes the decision. He's there for every single compromise and decision, and nothing moves forward unless all 5 of these men, Washington included, agree. And so everything goes through a compromise. And if you've ever tried to do that, it takes a tremendous amount of effort and patience. But that's Washington, because he realizes if he doesn't have 100% backing of this policy, it's going to fail. And if it's a foreign policy statement, you have to speak in one voice as a nation. And so he puts tremendous effort into making sure that happens.
Okay, so we have a number of questions about different aspects of the correspondence itself between Washington and these French officers. One of them, were there any disconnects or discrepancies, whether the 4 French high-ranking officers you mentioned, or were there any others Washington was corresponding with, where he was getting different reports, sort of conflicting ideas or reports of what was happening that he had to kind of work out for himself?
I think that's a really good question. I think he is corresponding with other European folks, some of whom, like the British intellectual Catherine Macaulay Graham. There's a Scottish member of Parliament he's getting reports from. He's also getting reports from other French intellectuals or former ambassadors, people like that, people who he stayed in touch with. None of them are really contradicting. I think the big difference is the specificity of the letters of the 4 French generals. And they're also, I think, because they're right there, they're right on the ground. Where somebody like Catherine Macaulay Graham, she's going to be writing it from a British perspective, a more intellectual perspective. These guys are in the eye of the storm. And secondly, I think because they're military men, I think they're writing in a way that it's a kind of direct, no nonsense way, the same way that Washington would. Whereas I think these other reports are going to be more, I think there's just a directness that these accounts have that I give them their value.
So among those 4 French generals, did any of them actually kind of hint at or even advocate for American neutrality? And once Washington made public the Neutrality Proclamation and the French learned about it, did that affect his relationship with these 4 French generals? Did it become strained, or did they kind of understand his position?
I think they understood the one thing, because it is so chaotic in France. And by this point, a couple of these men are already dead. So wouldn't even have been involved in the conversation. Lafayette, of course, is in prison. And then Rochambeau, I think at that point, is just trying to keep his head down. So I think they would have been supportive. I think they recognize that what's going on in France is not what has happened in the United States, and that it's a very, very different situation. And I think they would have respected and supported it. I think no one says this, but if you read letters, and I encourage everyone, these letters are available if you go to the Founder Archives, or if you get hold of the bound Washington papers, just look up the names. It's a fascinating correspondence. I think these French officers are embarrassed by their revolution, and I think they're disappointed that it goes off the rails, and that it doesn't land on its feet the way the American one did. And so I think there's a little bit of like, we tried, but this just got away from us. And I think they regret that their revolution didn't produce a George Washington, and that they're just impulses way beyond anything that they could control. That's sort of the sense you get kind of reading between the lines, that they know it's messed up and that they're doing the best they can, and it just gets away from them. So
was there any, once D'Estaing is killed in particular, was there any mention of that in this correspondence or in Washington's other correspondence?
No, and really
reaction to it?
By the time, you have this pretty lengthy correspondence, and then it just drops off. And then, because I think I'm not sure he corresponds with Rochambeau again after 1797, 93, 94. I think just because the situation in France is so chaotic. Lafayette, of course, is in prison and, gets released 1797. I think they exchange one or two letters. And then Washington, of course, dies in December 1799. So that's also gonna have an impact. Yeah, I think the pure of the correspondence just completely dries up. And that's also, a very telltale sign, because there's a regular change of letters going on between that window of 1789 and 1793. The mails actually reflect the political situation. The other thing is, a lot of this correspondence is not the U.S. Postal Service or even International Postal. It's finding someone who can carry these letters back and forth for you. And if you have a war going on, who's traveling across the ocean? It's much too dangerous. So that also is just going to cause the correspondence to dry up. Also, just where are these people? And if you go in hiding, you're not going to be sending out a lot of letters. So it's just the chaos of the situation causes the correspondence just to dry up. So
sure. So another question we have is, once it became clear the French Revolution was not going to turn out the way these French generals hoped or the way the American Revolution did Washington or any of his peers in America, his fellow officers who led the revolution, did they have any regret over France's assistance during our revolution, or were they able to kind of separate the two situations and their different circumstances?
I think personally and privately, they probably did. One of the people, and this is Henry Lee, who was the governor of Virginia during Washington's presidency. He's also the father of Robert E. Lee. He actually wants to raise a regiment and take it to France during this. And Washington's like, you can't do that. It's a kind of a misguided but very well intended, because he's like, look, but they helped us, we need to help them. And he's a career military man, and Washington's like, I get what you're saying, but you really can't, especially somebody that high, the governor of the state of Virginia. So I think personally and privately, and I'm sure Washington felt it very much, but at the same time, the risks are so great, and I think you have to put the nation's interest first. But I think, privately, these men, I think there's a genuine closeness and affection that these men feel for each other. And I think especially those letters in that window between 1784 and 1789, they're really heartfelt. There's definitely a band. This is a band of brothers. And I think privately and personally, absolutely. But I think publicly, there's not much you can do about it. So.
Mm-hmm. So one question of, did the American war debt to France coming out of our revolution have any bearing on the discussions, the correspondence back and forth from Washington to and his French correspondence during this period?
Yeah, that's a good question. As you might guess, at this point, France wants us to pay up. They want us to pay our bills. They need cash, obviously, and we don't have a ton of money on hand. So before things really spin out of control, 1789, 90, 91, that's really what they're more interested from us, is they want us to pay off what we owe. And we're doing it, but we're doing it very slowly. Whereas, again, before things spin out of control, we're thinking, well, let's have a free trade agreement with the French, or let's renew the one from the Revolution. And France is like, can you just write us a check, please? So, and then, of course, the situation gets so chaotic. It's sort of, Washington just says, let's just step back and let the dust settle here and see who's in charge and who's running the show. So.
So a good question that may seem simple, but were these letters, Washington famously did not speak or read French.
Correct.
So were these letters in English or a mixture? Was he having help with translation? How did that part work?
Yeah, I think this is, he didn't write or speak French. So at various times, Lafayette would serve as a translator. This is fascinating. When Washington and Rochambeau sit down to plan out what will become the Yorktown invasion, they have to have a translator there because they can't talk to each other. Washington, of course, had his various secretaries, Jackson Lear and people like that at Mount Vernon. So they're probably translating the letters. The letters are getting translated as they go across, things like that. But yeah, that's an excellent point, that these are translated versions in both cases. So something else Washington would do, and I think because he has secretaries and because he's dealing with so much correspondence as president, he tends to write. It's almost like someone with a lot of kids. You just send one email out to all the kids. He would write a similar letter to all four men. And so like there's one dated, I think it's like October 12, 1789. It's almost the identical letter to all four men. So we'd also do that, but you figure, well, his secretary already has to write out one, you might as well write out three. So he had a tendency to do that. And I think, but it also, I think, speaks to his affection for these men and his connection, that he wants to make sure he's keeping up with all four of them. So yeah, but translation became really important. Interestingly, too, in his cabinet, he both Jefferson and Edmund Randolph, who both spoke and read French, would play the same role. They would offer translations, because Citizen Genet, who really went out of his way to antagonize Washington, wrote all his correspondence in French. And so Jefferson and Randolph would take turns translating it. So.
Well, interesting that you mentioned Citizen Genet. We did have a question from someone about if you have a view on Citizen Genet.
Oh gosh, he's another one. You can't make this up. You can't, if you wrote this in a novel or had it in a movie, no one would believe you. The fact that the French minister comes over literally with a suitcase full of blank commissions and starts recruiting privateers. I mean, as soon as he steps foot in Charleston, South Carolina, he starts recruiting privateers. And the whole time he's minister, which is about 10 months, he never sees why that's a problem or why that's wrong. He also keeps thinking he'll just make a direct appeal to the American people, and that will bring them over the American cause. He just seems to think the Treaty of Alliance from the Revolution is still in effect, and he's just a guy who's just in his own world. And boy, I mean, that's another fun, I mean, it was a headache to try to sort it out, but it's also just this fun thing. I mean, this is a guy who is utterly clueless. Even Jefferson, who's very pro-French, has had it. I mean, he's just had it with Genet. And interestingly, because Jefferson was Secretary of State, he actually has to draft the recall letter. And I think he's actually kind of happy to do it. He's just had it with Genet, because every time you think you get Genet under control, he just comes right back at you. And just won't understand how the government works. He seems to think the Congress is in charge of foreign policy. That's one of the mistakes he makes. He, like I said, he keeps thinking, if I just make a direct appeal to the American people, America will ally with us and will come to war with us. And it's like, none of that's going to happen. So it's not terribly surprising. 10 months into his tenure, he is recalled by the French government. So, and again, an important moment for the US government, because again, if we're going to be neutral and this guy's violating neutrality, we've got to put our money where our mouth is. We can't put up with someone like Genet behaving with impunity. And that's exactly how he behaves. Interestingly, just as a side note, because the Jacobins have taken over, he was appointed by the Girondins. The French government says, you send him back. And you know what that means? It'd be, the end of Genet. And he actually spends the rest of his life in the United States. He marries an American woman. And he becomes like a gentleman farmer in the Hudson River. So he kind of lands on his feet, despite his sort of controversial tenure. But Washington's like, we just want him out of the job. We don't want his head. And so Washington says, well, we won't send him back. We'll keep him here, which I think was a humane thing to do, because everyone knows where Mr. Citizen Genet is going if he goes back to France. So,
well, I think we've gone through most of our questions, and had one I wanted to wrap up with, which was about the legacy of the Neutrality Proclamation that Washington issued. Beyond Washington's own presidency, was it, did it really have legs beyond that, or how did subsequent presidents deal with that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, by the way, someone just married the New York governor at the time. That's who Genet married. So, the world gets smaller and smaller. Yeah, I think neutrality becomes, I always describe my project as this idea of like, it's hiding in plain sight, if you know what I mean, because it's so overarching. It's such a meta theme in American foreign policy. We kind of forgot it was there. And so we focus on things like the War of 1812, the quasi-war with France, eventually the Monroe Doctrine, all of these kind of things, Jay Treaty, all of that, without realizing that the overarching theme of all of that is America's desire to be autonomous and sovereign in foreign affairs. And neutrality is the principle. It's the doctrine. It's that idea. Essentially, these other challenges, whether the quasi-war, which is when France is beating up on American ships, that's more of an effort to maintain neutrality. Similarly with Jay Treaty, which is trying to get Britain to back off. The War of 1812, ultimately, which is about trade and impressment and all that. All of these go back to this idea of neutrality and our desire treated as a sovereign autonomous nation, but also to enjoy the rights and privileges of that, and to enjoy free trade and not have to get involved in conflicts that don't concern us. And so you can just see it carrying through. The second thing that happens is the proclamations, and there are actually two of them. One deals with the West and the one deals with the Atlantic, are actually codified into law. And then eventually they'll get renewed by subsequent administrations into the 1820s, 1830s, things like that. One of the stories of the 19th century, though, is then America turns sort of inward and starts focusing on the West and westward expansion and things like that. So the Atlantic becomes less of an issue. Also, we become a more powerful and stronger. We gain control of the Mississippi River, things like that. So it also seems to sort of diminish in importance, but it doesn't. It's just not as prominent because we're focused on the Mexican-American War and moving west and all of that, and treaties dealing with our northern boundary and stuff like that. But it is absolutely, I think, one of the major themes of 19th century foreign policy, but that we forgot about because we got lost in all these smaller pieces, not realizing it's kind of that it's the umbrella of all of these policies. and that you can see the Monroe Doctrine as almost like an addendum to it, of a further assertion, but it's not just on the Atlantic, but now in South America. And that, again, we asserting our autonomy and our sovereignty. So.
Wonderful. Well, I think we will end there. Thank you, Sandra, very much. And thank all of you for out there for joining us. As you all leave the webinar, a survey from Google Forms will appear on your screen, and we hope you'll take a few minutes to share your thoughts about tonight's program and any suggestions you have for other aspects of the revolution and its legacy that you think would make interesting future programs. Your feedback is really helpful for us as we develop our programming calendar going forward. So thank you again, Dr. Moats,
Thank you, Emily, and thank you very much. This was just a great opportunity to talk to all of you. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all the questions. This was very enjoyable. So
good. Yes, good discussion. And I have to put this plug in there if anyone's interested, certainly in reading more about this subject, to check out Dr. Moats's book. But if anyone's interested in reading more about the early Society of the Cincinnati and correspondence among our members, please do come to our research library as well, where we have the Society's archives that contains a lot of related correspondence about the Society and other matters from the time period. So thank you all again for attending. I hope you have a good evening and that we'll see you next time.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. I appreciate it. Good night. Thank you.
Good night.